Yo, guys! Jim here from DrinkABeerandPlayAGame, and today I'm going to start my look at the first 10 games in the Atari Flashback 2. Starting off is the adventure-style games, and we're going to go with Adventure. Well, that makes sense. Anyway, released in 1979, this was developed and published by Atari. It was designed by Warren Robinette? I'm not sure how to say that. But this is one of the first action-adventure fantasy games to ever hit a console. Think of it as the great-grandfather to Legend of Zelda. The goal of the game is to bring a chalice from one castle to another. Along the way, the character needs to overcome puzzles and dragons. The player can use a sword to fight off the dragons, a magnet to grab key items, keys, bridges, but there's also a bat that can come and steal and misplace the items, making your life a lot more annoying. It's famously known for having one of the first Easter eggs in the game, as Warren put his name inside of it. Although on these later flashback and plug-and-play releases it got edited out. Personally, I find the game to be really enjoyable. The first game mode's pretty straightforward, but the other ones can get complicated fast. And the biggest annoyances in them to me are the dark mazes, because you can't see anything and it's really just a big memorization game. And really, if you memorize how to beat all the levels, you can breeze through the game every time. I typically just play the first game to get my fill because I don't know. I find the other versions to be a little too frustrating. But, especially if you're a big Legend of Zelda fan or you like the genre, I would say definitely check this out at least once.
When it comes to adventure, let me just get the fact that this has one hell of a prestigious legacy that it laid forth. It is the first action-adventure game, really the first console fantasy game. The fact that this is the first game to really have a true open world, to use a fog of war effect, and just the fact that this is one of the few Atari games that really just didn't have a time limit and let you do what you want. Those are all great features, and it cannot be denied that this was a true innovator for video games. With all that being said, although I did appreciate some touches like the fog of war that I mentioned, the game never really grabbed me. I understand what they were going for, and it was an interesting little game, but I found myself getting bored. And yes, I did beat it, and I love the fact that they also included the first Easter egg in a video game as well. But still, this is one, unless you're a die-hard Atari fan, or you're really trying to get a collection, you probably should avoid it.
Next up, we have Adventure 2. Released in 2005, this is a Flashback 2 exclusive. It was designed by Kurt Vendel, who did a lot of the design work on the console itself. This game takes a lot of the same notes from the first adventure, and it just made the game a lot larger. The mazes in the game are a lot more complex than the original adventure, and I just didn't find myself caring for it too much. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad, but it's just something that it isn't for me. So, if you love the harder stages of the first adventure, I would definitely say give this a shot. Next up, we have Haunted House. Released in 1981, this was developed and published by Atari and designed by James Andreessen. It is widely considered to be the first survival horror game, which if you know anything about our page is right up our alley. The point of the game is to escape the house with 3 pieces of an urn. In the player's way is the ghost of the guy who used to own the house, a bat, and a tarantula. The player has a lot of items to help him out, which include keys to open locked doors, and a wand that can ward off enemies. Also, the player has a number of matches that he can light, and when the room is lit up, he can see the items that are in there. Unfortunately, if he runs into one of these enemies, they blow out the match. The game has 9 difficulties, and the game gets progressively harder. In the later levels, the enemies get a lot more aggressive, and in the hardest levels, you can't even see the walls without lighting a match. I found this game to be really interesting. The graphics are simple, but the little music clips and the sound in general just creates this really spooky mood. No lie, the sounds that were coming from this game freaked out my 70-pound pit bull. The game can be fun, but it is frustrating. I didn't really find myself playing through that many of the game modes, as the random search aspect of the game just didn't appeal to me. Fans of Silent Hill or Resident Evil should definitely check this out and see where the genre came from.
For those of you who are fans of our page, it should come to no surprise that I really enjoy Haunted House. Why? Because it is one of the first survival horror video games, and it's actually just a really decent game overall. It's clearly not perfect, so let me just put that out there. But I love the atmosphere it sets with such a dark house. I mean, it gets ridiculous. It's the fact that all you can see is eyeballs is goddamn ridiculous, but it's also kind of hilarious. The fact that the monsters can blow out your match adds an added element of difficulty, and I don't care who you are, when you finally get the urn together and exit the house, that music is awesome. If you're a horror fan or even an Atari fan, this is one I would really suggest. I think it's one of the more classic games because, once again, you're not so much worried about score as completing a specific objective.
Following that, we have Return to Haunted House. This is an unofficial sequel, as it was programmed exclusively for the Flashback 2. The game uses the adventure engine, and it plays much differently than its predecessor. The game involves very, very large mazes where the player can take a key to open a door and try to grab another item. I guess it's all part to try to get out of the house once again, but I didn't really like this one at all. The mazes were gigantic, and the ghosts in this game are even more aggressive and faster than the dragons in Adventure. I just found myself getting really frustrated, and I don't see myself going back to this anytime soon. Here we have Secret Quest. Released in 1989, this was developed by Axeline and published by Atari Corp. This is one of the last in a series of games released for the 2600. In this game, you guide a player through a number of space stations. You need to find a secret code to activate a bomb and transport off the station before it blows up. Along the way, the player can fight monsters to drop items. These items restore oxygen and energy for your weapon. I instantly fell in love with this game. The graphics are decent for a 2600 game, but the background music in general is just a great touch. The game pushes the 2600 to its limits, and it's really a pretty large game. The controls are damn near perfect, and I just really love the balance between the action and puzzle parts of the game. The stations become bigger and bigger, and it takes a lot of strategy to make it far in this game. You really need to learn how to balance using your energy for your weapon, and killing monsters, taking the risk of fighting them, and using up oxygen. Honestly, it's a must-play for the system, and if you're turning into a 2600 collector, I consider it to be a must-own, even though it's a little rare because of how late it came out. Rounding out the adventure games, we have Wizard. Originally designed in 1980 by Chris Crawford, this game was never released for the 2600. It debuted on the Flashback 2, and it's an exclusive to the system, even if it is just a prototype. This game has a very simple premise. You're a wizard and you fight an enemy in a maze-like arena. The player moves faster but fires slower, whereas the enemy can move through walls and is invisible until the player character has line of sight. There's a faint heartbeat in the background that gets louder as the enemy gets closer, so that gives you an idea of where the bad guy is. It's a cool idea, but I kind of found the game to be boring. Once I figured out how to play it, it's okay, but I just found myself beating a few enemies and then turning it off. Maybe you'll enjoy it more than I did, but it just wasn't for me. A cool thing, though, is that there is a 2-player mode, so that's probably more fun. I just didn't get a chance to try it out. Moving on to the arcade section, we have Arcade Asteroids. The original version of Asteroids came out in 1979 and was developed and published by Atari. This is a hacked version of the 2600 port that came out in 1981. The sprites were changed from the VCS original to make it more closely resemble the arcade. The gameplay is basically the same as the original. The point of the game is to destroy spaceships and other asteroids that break up into smaller pieces. There's really no ending, you just try and get the highest score possible. This port retains the warp feature that will randomly place you on another location of the map, so that can get you out of a jam or screw you over. I don't think there's a lot to say about Asteroids. It's an all-time classic. I have fun with the game, but for the purposes of this video, this was damn near impossible to record footage for, so my gameplay is kind of suffering. I guess it's the combination of the original vector-based graphics and the interlacing of the 2600, but it's a little rough to record with. Honestly, if you're just playing this to play it, if you like Asteroids, you'll be perfectly fine with this port. Next up is Arcade Pong. Originally released in 1972 to arcades, this was developed and published by Atari and designed by Alan Alcorn. This is... Alright, come on, it's Pong. It's one of the most famous games of all time. This port's an exclusive to the Flashback 2 in that it tries to replicate the arcade cabinet of the original game. It plays like Pong. The point of the game is to knock the ball past your opponent. You have 1 and 2 player options, and if you have the paddle controllers, you can use them too. Honestly, if you like Pong, this is more the same. I find it boring against a computer, but you know what? It can be a lot of fun against a friend. It makes for great drinking games as well. If you've never played it before, you owe it to yourself to grab a buddy and see what the hype was all about. Next up is Asteroids Deluxe. Yet another exclusive to the Flashback 2, this game is almost entirely vector-based when it comes to graphics. Instead of using the warp, the player gets a shield to avoid being killed. It's a fun take on the original game, though the vector graphics make it impossible to play and record footage at the same time. What can I say? It's Asteroids, and I have just as much fun with this one as I do the other version on here. If you're a fan of Asteroids, give it a shot. Rounding out today's video, we have Centipede. Originally released to arcades in 1980, the 2600 port was released in 1982, and it was developed and published by Atari. The goal of the game is to fight and destroy pieces of the centipede before it kills the player. There's other monsters that can come across the screen and make your life hell. Some will just drop right down to the player, there's a spider that jumps around in random patterns, and some will leave special mushrooms that will push the centipede pieces right to the bottom floor. I've always been a sucker for Centipede, and really this version is no different. Sure, it doesn't play with the trackball, but that's kind of common for a lot of the home ports. I can go back and play Centipede again and again, and this is really another one of those where if you haven't played it by now, you should definitely check it out. Well, that'll do it for today's episode. Be sure to check in next week when we go through games 11 through 20. As always, remember to drink your beers and play your games responsibly. Cheers, guys!